Some wounds never heal, they just learn to hide beneath the surface until life forces them back into the light. Marcus Holloway had spent 15 years running from the guilt of abandoning his family, building a cattle empire to fill the hollow space where his heart used to be. Now, in the harsh Wyoming territory of 1882, he's come to the forgotten town of Cedar Ridge to settle his dead brother's affairs. What he finds there stops him cold. 2 orphaned children living alone in a broken-down cabin, surviving on nothing but scraps and hope. 10-year-old Daniel doesn't beg for help or ask for pity. He looks Marcus straight in the eye and makes a simple offer. "I will cut wood and my sister will cook." Those 8 words from a boy barely tall enough to reach a man's belt buckle are about to change everything Marcus thought he knew about himself. Can a promise between strangers become the foundation for a family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through Cedar Ridge like a blade, carrying the promise of a winter that would test every soul foolish enough to remain in this godforsaken corner of Wyoming territory. Marcus Holloway pulled his coat tighter as he surveyed the town from his vantage point atop the ridge that gave the settlement its name. 15 buildings, maybe 20, if you counted the half-collapsed structures that looked ready to surrender to the next strong gust. This was what his brother Henry had called home for the past decade. Marcus had built his cattle empire 300 miles south, in the rolling grasslands where beef could graze year-round and railroad connections meant prosperity. His lazy H. Brand was known from Denver to Cheyenne, and his word carried weight in territorial politics. Men tipped their hats when he passed, and bankers competed for his business. He owned more land than some eastern states, employed over 200 men, and could buy and sell most small towns without feeling the pinch. Yet standing here in the bitter wind, looking down at this dying settlement, he felt poorer than he'd ever been. The guilt had been his constant companion for 15 years now, ever since that morning when he'd saddled his horse before dawn and ridden away from his wife Emma and their 5-year-old son James. He told himself then that he was no good for them, that they deserved better than a man who couldn't shake the nightmares from the war or hold down steady work. The bottle had been easier than facing their disappointed eyes each morning, but running away hadn't killed the guilt. It had only fed it, growing fat and poisonous in the dark corners of his mind. Every success in business felt hollow. Every dollar earned was blood money paid for abandoning those who'd needed him most. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Emma had died of consumption 3 years after he left, and that James had been raised by her sister in Boston. The boy would be 20 now, a man Marcus wouldn't recognize if they passed on the street. The letter from Henry's lawyer had arrived 6 weeks ago, brief and to the point. Henry was dead. Consumption, same as Emma, and Marcus was the sole heir to his brother's modest estate in Cedar Ridge. There wasn't much. A small cabin, 40 acres of marginal grazing land, and debts that barely exceeded the property's value. Marcus could have handled it all through lawyers and agents, never setting foot in this desolate place. But something in the lawyer's postscript had gnawed at him. Your brother spoke of you often, especially near the end. He believed you were a better man than you thought yourself to be. Henry had always seen too much, even as children, while Marcus fought and drank and ran from every good thing in his life. Henry had stayed quiet and steady, becoming a schoolteacher and then a small rancher, never judging, but always hoping his older brother might find his way home. Now Marcus stood at the edge of Cedar Ridge, feeling like he was 15 again and late for Sunday service, knowing Ma would have words about his muddy boots and Henry would share his hymnal without complaint. The main street was little more than a wagon track with wooden sidewalks that had seen better decades. The general store's paint was peeling, the saloon's sign hung crooked, and the church steeple listed slightly to the east, as if the whole building was trying to lean away from the prevailing wind. Only Doc Whitman's office showed signs of recent care. its windows clean and shutters properly hung. Marcus tied his horse to the rail outside Sullivan's general store and pushed through the door, setting a bell to jangling. The woman behind the counter looked up from her account books. Martha Sullivan, if the painted sign was accurate. She had the weathered face of a frontier wife, grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had seen their share of hardship without losing their kindness. "You'd be Marcus Holloway," she said, setting down her pen. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Come to settle my brother's affairs. Henry was a good man. This town's poorer for his passing." She studied Marcus with the frank appraisal of someone accustomed to taking measure of strangers. "He talked about you considerable toward the end." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing too unfavorable, I hope. Quite the opposite. Said you'd built yourself quite an operation down south. Said you had more grit than sense, but a good heart underneath all the bluster." Martha's smile was gentle but knowing. "Also said you'd been running from something for most of your adult life, and maybe it was time you stopped." The words hit like a physical blow, Henry's voice so clear in them that Marcus had to steady himself against the counter. His brother had always possessed an uncomfortable talent for seeing straight through to the truth of things. The lawyer said there wasn't much to the estate, Marcus managed. "Depends on how you measure worth," Martha replied. "Henry's 40 acres isn't much for grazing, but the cabin's solid and the well runs clean year-round. There's also the matter of Daniel and Rebecca." "Who?" Martha's expression grew somber. "The Cartwright children. Their folks died of fever this past summer, both parents within a week of each other. Poor little ones were set to be shipped east to one of those orphan asylums, but Henry took them in. Been caring for them these past 3 months. Marcus felt the familiar urge to mount his horse and ride hard for home. Complications were the last thing he needed. Surely there are relatives, none that'll claim them. The Cartwrights were good people, but they came west with nothing but hope and determination. When the fever took them, it left those children with nothing but each other. What's that to do with me?" Martha's eyes hardened slightly. "Henry left them the cabin and the land. Legal papers are all drawn up proper, but they're just babies. Daniel's 10 and Rebecca's 8. They need someone to look after them until they're grown, someone to make sure they don't get cheated out of what's rightfully theirs." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not the man for that kind of responsibility. There must be other families in a town this size, with winter coming on." Martha's voice carried the weight of hard experience. "Most folks here are barely scraping by as it is. We all help where we can, but taking in 2 children for the next decade, that's beyond most people's means." She moved around the counter and fixed Marcus with a look that reminded him powerfully of his mother. "Your brother believed you might step up given the chance. He left a letter for you, along with some of his things." Martha disappeared into the back room and returned with a wooden crate and a sealed envelope. The crate was heavy, filled with Henry's books, a few photographs, and personal items that represented a lifetime of modest accumulation. At the bottom, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was their mother's Bible, the same worn leather volume that had sat on her kitchen table through Marcus's childhood. His hands shook slightly as he unwrapped it. The pages were yellow with age, the binding cracked but still holding. On the inside cover, in their mother's careful script, were the family records, births, deaths, marriages stretching back 3 generations. Henry's death was recorded in his own hand, dated just a week before he passed, as if he'd known his time was short. "He read from that every Sunday," Martha said softly. "Said it helped him feel closer to home." Marcus closed the Bible quickly, unable to look at those familiar pages any longer. The past was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when present obligations were pressing down like stones on his chest. "Where are the children now?" he asked. "In Henry's cabin, same as they've been. Daniel's been keeping the place running, chopping wood, tending the animals, making repairs where he can. Rebecca does the cooking and keeps house. They're managing, but just barely. The walk to Henry's cabin took 10 minutes through streets that grew progressively more rutted and poor. The house sat on the eastern edge of town, a modest structure of chinked logs with a stone chimney and a small barn behind. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Marcus could see recent repairs to the roof where new shakes had been nailed over older ones. Daniel was splitting wood behind the cabin, his small frame dwarfed by the full-sized axe he wielded with determined efficiency. The boy had dark hair and serious brown eyes, and he worked with the focused intensity of someone far older than his years. He looked up as Marcus approached, setting down the axe and wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold air. "You'd be Mr. Holloway," Daniel said, his voice carrying the same certainty Martha had shown. "Mrs. Sullivan said you'd be coming." "That's right." Marcus found himself studying the boy's face, looking for some echo of his own son at that age. "You're Daniel Cartwright." "Yes, sir. This is your brother's place now, I reckon." There was no resentment in the boy's voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that would have been heartbreaking from someone twice his age. Daniel had learned early that life could change without warning, that security was never guaranteed. "Actually, according to the lawyers, the place belongs to you and your sister." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, but he kept his composure. "Henry, Mr. Holloway. He said something about that before he died. Didn't rightly believe it, though." The cabin door opened, and a small girl emerged, wiping her hands on a flour sack apron that was too large for her frame. Rebecca Cartwright had the same dark hair as her brother, but where Daniel's expression was guarded and serious, hers held a warmth that seemed to light up the grey afternoon. She couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds, soaking wet, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Dinner's ready," she announced, then looked curiously at Marcus. "Are you staying to eat?" The question was asked with such natural hospitality that Marcus felt his throat tighten. This child, who had every reason to be suspicious of strangers, was inviting him to share their table without hesitation. "I don't want to impose." "No imposition," Daniel said firmly. "Rebecca's a fine cook, and there's plenty." Inside, the cabin was smaller than Marcus had expected, but spotlessly clean and well-organized. The main room served as kitchen, dining area and parlor, with a stone fireplace providing warmth and light. 2 small bedrooms opened off the back, and a ladder led to a loft space under the eaves. The furniture was simple but sturdy, built to last rather than impress. Rebecca had prepared a meal of cornbread, beans, and salt pork. Simple fare, but well-prepared and generously portioned. She served Marcus first, as befitted a guest, then her brother, then herself. Throughout the meal, both children displayed manners that would have done credit to a finishing school. "Mrs. Sullivan says you run cattle down south," Daniel said as they ate. "That's right, about 300 miles from here. Must be fine country for grazing to support a big operation." Marcus was surprised by the boy's knowledge of ranching. "You know about cattle?" "Some. Pa ran a small herd before he died, only 20 head, but he taught me about grass and water, breeding and market timing." Daniel's voice grew wistful. "Always said he'd build the herd up once we got established." "Proper. What happened to the cattle?" "Sold them to pay for the doctor and the medicines, and then the funeral expenses." Rebecca's voice was matter-of-fact, but Marcus heard the underlying sadness. "Didn't help Pa and Ma none, but it was what needed doing." The children spoke of their parents' death with the resigned acceptance of those who'd had their innocence stripped away too early. They'd learned that grief was a luxury they couldn't afford, that survival required constant vigilance and practical decisions. After dinner, Marcus helped Daniel with the evening chores, while Rebecca cleaned the dishes and prepared tomorrow's breakfast. The boy worked with methodical efficiency, checking on the 2 milk cows, the handful of chickens, and the old draft horse that Henry had used for farming. "How long can you 2 manage on your own?" Marcus asked, as they forked hay into the horses. "Stall." Daniel considered the question seriously. "Through winter, if the weather's not too harsh. Come spring, I'll need to find work to buy seed and supplies for planting." "You're planning to farm this land?" "It's what Henry intended. The soil's good for vegetables and hay, even if it's not prime grazing. He was teaching me about crop rotation and soil improvement. Daniel's voice carried quiet pride. Said I had a good head for agriculture. They finished the chores in comfortable silence, and Marcus found himself impressed by the boy's competence. Daniel moved through his tasks with the confidence of long practice, clearly accustomed to bearing responsibility far beyond his years. Back in the cabin, Rebecca was mending a shirt by lamplight, her small fingers moving the needle with careful precision. She looked up as they entered, offering a smile that transformed her thin face. "There's coffee if you'd like some, Mr. Holloway." As they sat by the fire, Marcus found himself studying these two remarkable children. They faced an uncertain future, with courage and determination that humbled him. They'd lost everything that mattered: parents, security, the carefree days of childhood, yet they carried themselves with dignity and grace. "Mrs. Sullivan mentioned that you might be sent east," he said carefully. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The territorial agent was here last week, said there's an asylum in Chicago that takes frontier orphans. What do you think about that?" "Think it's not what our parents would have wanted," Daniel replied firmly. "They came west to make a life, not to see their children shipped back east like damaged goods." Rebecca set down her mending and looked directly at Marcus. "We don't want to be a burden on anyone. Daniel and I can work for our keep." "That's right," Daniel added. "I can cut wood and tend animals, do repairs and farming. Rebecca can cook and keep house, tend gardens and preserve food." He paused, then delivered the words that would echo in Marcus's memory for years to come. "I will cut wood, and my sister will cook." The simple declaration carried such quiet dignity that Marcus felt something shift deep in his chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for 15 years. These children weren't begging or pleading. They were offering to earn their place in the world through honest work, asking for nothing more than the chance to prove their worth. As the evening wore on and the fire burned low, Marcus found himself reluctant to leave. The cabin held a warmth that had nothing to do with the blazing logs. It was the warmth of a home where people cared for one another, where love was expressed through daily acts of service rather than grand gestures. When he finally stood to go, Daniel walked him to the door. "Will we see you again, Mr. Holloway? I'll be in town for a few more days, settling Henry's affairs. Maybe you could come for dinner tomorrow. Rebecca makes fine biscuits on Sundays." The invitation was offered without expectation, but with hope that was almost painful to witness. These children had learned not to count on adult promises, yet they continued to extend trust and kindness to virtual strangers. As Marcus rode back to the hotel in town, his mind churned with conflicting emotions. He'd come to Cedar Ridge to close a chapter of his past, not to open a new one. His business empire demanded his attention, his partners expected his quick return, and winter was coming on fast. But something in Daniel's steady gaze and Rebecca's trusting smile had awakened feelings he'd thought buried forever. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus found himself thinking not about the past he'd fled, but about the future he might still have time to build. Marcus spent a restless night at the Cedar Ridge Hotel, a generous name for what amounted to a boarding house with pretensions. The thin walls carried every creak and groan of the building settling against the wind, and his mind refused to quiet itself long enough for sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's serious face and Rebecca's trusting smile, heard the boy's simple declaration echoing in the darkness. Morning brought no relief, only the bitter taste of coffee that had been brewing since before dawn, and the weight of decisions he wasn't ready to make. He'd planned to spend the day reviewing Henry's papers with the lawyer, sign whatever documents needed signing, and catch the afternoon stage back to civilization. Instead, he found himself walking toward the cabin, as if drawn by invisible threads. The sound of shouting reached him before he cleared the tree line. Marcus quickened his pace, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt at his hip, a habit from his early days on the frontier that expensive suits and city living had never quite erased. He found Daniel in the yard, facing down a tall, thin man in a dusty suit and bowler hat. The stranger held a sheaf of papers in one hand and gestured emphatically with the other, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority accustomed to being obeyed. "Not negotiable, boy. These children are wards of the territory now, and the territory has made arrangements for their care." "We don't need arrangements," Daniel replied, his young voice steady despite the circumstances. "We're managing fine on our own." The man in the suit noticed Marcus's approach and straightened, adopting the officious bearing of a government functionary. "You must be Holloway. I'm James Winters, territorial agent for orphaned children. I was just explaining to young Daniel here that decisions about his and his sister's future are no longer his to make." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What kind of decisions?" Winters consulted his papers with bureaucratic precision. "The Chicago Home for Displaced Children has agreed to take both children. It's an excellent facility. 3 meals a day, basic education, moral instruction and training in useful trades. The boy will learn carpentry or farming, the girl domestic service. Much better than letting them run wild on the frontier." "They're not running wild," Marcus said carefully. "They're managing their own property." "Ah, yes, about that." Winters produced another document with the flourish of a stage magician. "There's been a legal challenge to the inheritance. Seems there are debts against the property that exceed its value. The land will have to be sold to satisfy creditors." Daniel went pale but held his ground. "Henry said the land was ours. He had papers drawn up legal." "Children can't inherit property without proper guardianship," Winters explained with condescending patience. "And since no suitable guardian has stepped forward, the territory must act in their best interests." Marcus studied the papers Winters held, his years of business dealings having taught him to spot irregularities. "Who's making this claim against the property?" "The Cedar Ridge Development Company. They hold notes on improvements made to the land, tools purchased, livestock bought. Substantial debts, according to their records." Something in Winter's tone set Marcus's instincts on edge. He'd dealt with enough land speculators to recognize the smell of a fraudulent claim. "I'd like to see those records." "I'm afraid that's not possible. The company's books are confidential business matters." Winters folded the papers and tucked them inside his coat. "The important thing is that arrangements have been made for the children's welfare. The stage to Cheyenne leaves Thursday morning. From there, they'll take the railroad to Chicago." Rebecca appeared in the cabin doorway, having heard the raised voices. She stayed close to the threshold, ready to flee if necessary, but her eyes were fixed on her brother with fierce loyalty. "We won't go," Daniel said quietly. "This is our home." Winters sighed with theatrical patience. "Boy, you're 10 years old. You don't get to decide where you live or what's best for you. The territorial government has that authority, and we've exercised it. You and your sister will be on that stage Thursday, voluntarily or otherwise." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly drawing chimney. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, not the hot, impulsive anger of his youth, but something deeper and more dangerous. These children had already lost everything that mattered to them, and now bureaucrats and land grabbers wanted to steal what little remained. "What if they had a guardian?" Marcus heard himself say. Winters turned, eyebrows raised. "I beg your pardon. You said children can't inherit without proper guardianship. What if someone stepped forward to take responsibility for them?" "Well, theoretically that would change matters. But any guardian would have to be approved by the territorial court, demonstrate financial stability, moral character." Winters's voice trailed off as he took in Marcus's expensive clothes and confident bearing. "Are you suggesting you might—" "I'm suggesting I want to see those debt records before anyone goes anywhere." The two men stared at each other in silence that stretched taut as a bowstring. Finally, Winters cleared his throat and consulted his pocket watch. "I suppose there's no immediate rush. The children are safe enough for now, but I'll need an answer by Wednesday if you're serious about guardianship proceedings." After Winters departed, Marcus found himself alone with Daniel and Rebecca. The boy stood straighter now, hope and wariness warring in his expression. Rebecca had crept closer, no longer hiding behind the doorframe, but still ready to bolt if circumstances turned against them. "Did you mean it?" Daniel asked. "About being our guardian?" Marcus looked at these two brave children who'd faced down a government agent with more dignity than most grown men could muster. He thought about his empty mansion 300 miles south, his successful business that gave him everything except purpose, his son James growing up without a father's guidance. "I meant it," he said, and felt the words settling into his bones, like truth finally spoken aloud. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather, as if the world wanted to offer a brief respite before winter's final assault. Marcus spent the early hours in town, visiting the lawyer's office and the courthouse, learning what he could about territorial law and guardianship requirements. The legal research proved encouraging. As a property owner and successful businessman, Marcus would have little trouble meeting the court's standards for guardianship. The more troubling issue was the debt claim against Henry's property. The Cedar Ridge Development Company was a new entity with no apparent local connections, yet they claimed to hold substantial notes against a man who'd been known for his frugal habits and careful management. Martha Sullivan proved helpful when Marcus stopped by her store for supplies. She'd lived in Cedar Ridge for 20 years and knew everyone who'd ever extended credit to Henry Holloway. "Development Company," Martha snorted with derision. "Never heard of them, and I know every merchant and creditor within 50 miles. Henry paid his debts promptly and never borrowed more than he could repay. If someone's claiming he owed money, they're either mistaken or lying." By afternoon, Marcus had formed a clear picture of what they were up against. Someone was using fraudulent debt claims to steal the children's inheritance, counting on the fact that orphans had no one to fight for them. It was a scheme as old as the frontier itself, and it made Marcus's blood boil. He returned to the cabin to find Rebecca in the garden, harvesting the last of the fall vegetables before the first hard frost could claim them. She worked with quiet efficiency, her small hands gentle with the plants that had fed them through the autumn months. "Rebecca," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up with a smile that made his chest tight. "Hello, Mr. Holloway. Daniel's fixing." The barn door, one of the hinges, came loose. "I wanted to talk to you both about something important." Daniel emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. At 10 years old, he already carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility, someone who'd learned that work was the price of security. Marcus knelt down so he could look both children in the eye. "I've been thinking about what Mr. Winters said yesterday, about guardianship and the legal proceedings. If I were to become your guardian officially, it would mean some changes." "What kind of changes?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Well, for one thing, we'd need to fight these debt claims in court. That could take months to resolve, and there's no guarantee we'd win. In the meantime, you'd both be living with uncertainty." Rebecca tilted her head thoughtfully. "We've been living with uncertainty since Ma and Pa died. At least this way we'd be uncertain together." The simple wisdom of her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. These children understood that security was an illusion, that the only real safety came from the bonds between people who chose to care for each other. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "My business is down south, near Cheyenne. Eventually we might need to relocate there." Daniel's face fell slightly. "This is our home. I understand that, and I'm not saying we'd have to leave immediately, or even at all. But I want you both to know what you'd be getting into." The children exchanged one of those wordless communications that siblings master early. Some complex negotiation took place in the space of a few heartbeats, weighing options and possibilities that adults might debate for hours. "Mr. Holloway," Rebecca said finally, "if you became our guardian, would that mean you'd be like our father?" The question was asked with such innocent directness that Marcus felt his throat close. He thought of James, the son he'd abandoned, and wondered if it was too late to learn how to be the father he should have been. "I'd do my best to be," he managed. Daniel straightened his shoulders with visible resolve. "Then we'd be honored to have you as our guardian, sir, and we'll face whatever comes together. Court battles, moving, whatever it takes." As Marcus looked at these two remarkable children, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Hope for a future that might heal the wounds of the past. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles and uncertain outcomes, but for the first time since he'd ridden away from his own family, Marcus felt like he was riding towards something instead of away from it. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing Rebecca's excellent cornbread and listening to Daniel's plans for expanding the vegetable garden come spring, Marcus pulled out the one thing he'd kept from his previous life, a small daguerreotype in a silver frame. The photograph showed a younger Marcus with a beautiful woman and a laughing child, all three of them dressed in their Sunday best. "That's my son James," he said quietly, setting the photograph on the table where the children could see it. "He'd be about 20 now. I haven't seen him since he was 5. Daniel studied the photograph with serious attention. "He looks like you." "Yes, he does. Too much like me, maybe." Marcus touched the frame gently. "I made mistakes with him that I can't undo, but maybe I can do better this time." Rebecca reached across the table and patted his hand with maternal comfort that would have been heartbreaking if it hadn't been so genuine. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Mr. Holloway, even fathers." As winter wind rattled the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, Marcus felt the scattered pieces of his life beginning to form a new pattern. The guilt would always be there, the regret over choices that couldn't be unmade. But sitting at this simple table with these extraordinary children, he began to believe that redemption might still be possible for a man who'd thought himself beyond saving. The transformation began with small things: a new lock for the cabin door, warmer blankets for the approaching winter, and a visit from Doc Whitman to ensure both children were in good health. Marcus found himself moving through these practical arrangements with the methodical precision he'd learned in business, but underneath ran a current of uncertainty that no amount of money or influence could resolve. Being responsible for 2 children was vastly different from managing cattle operations or negotiating land deals. Daniel and Rebecca had their own rhythms, their own needs and fears that couldn't be addressed with ledger books and contracts. They needed something Marcus wasn't sure he still knew how to give, the steady presence of someone who cared more about their well-being than his own comfort. The first week passed in careful adjustments. Marcus took rooms at the hotel, but spent his days at the cabin, learning the routines that kept the small household functioning. Daniel rose before dawn to tend the animals and split wood for the day's cooking and heating. Rebecca managed the kitchen with impressive skill, stretching simple ingredients into meals that satisfied both hunger and the need for comfort. Marcus watched them work with growing admiration. These children had survived the loss of everything familiar, yet they'd maintained not just their dignity, but their capacity for joy. Rebecca hummed while she cooked, and Daniel whistled while he worked, small affirmations that their spirits hadn't been broken by hardship. "You don't need to stay with us all day," Daniel said on the 4th morning, finding Marcus reading legal documents by the kitchen window. "We're used to managing on our own." "I know you are," Marcus replied, setting down the papers. "But if I'm going to be your guardian, I need to understand how you live, what you need." Daniel considered this with the gravity of someone far older than his years. "What we need most is for someone to believe we're worth keeping." The simple honesty of the statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. These children weren't asking for luxuries or special treatment. They wanted the basic security of knowing they belonged somewhere, that someone had chosen them not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He retrieved his father's silver pocket watch from his traveling case and found Daniel in the barn, teaching Rebecca how to properly curry the old draft horse. "Daniel," he called, holding out the watch, "I'd like you to have this." The boy stared at the offered timepiece, as if Marcus had extended a snake. "Sir, I couldn't. That's too valuable." "It belonged to my father, and his father before him. It's meant to be passed down to the next generation." Marcus pressed the watch into Daniel's reluctant hands. "A man needs to know the value of time, how to manage it properly. I think you understand that better than most." Daniel opened the watch case and studied the intricate mechanism within. His face glowed with wonder at the precise movement of gears and springs, the steady tick that marked each passing second. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. "I'll take good care of it. I know you will." Rebecca appeared at Daniel's shoulder, standing on tiptoe to see the watch. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Look how the numbers shine." As Marcus watched the children examine the watch together, he felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he'd almost forgotten, the satisfaction that came from giving something meaningful to people who truly appreciated it. For 15 years, he'd accumulated wealth and possessions, but he'd forgotten the simple pleasure of sharing what mattered. The legal challenges proved more complex than Marcus had anticipated. The Cedar Ridge Development Company's claim appeared legitimate on the surface, complete with promissory notes bearing Henry's signature and witnessed by individuals who swore to their authenticity. Only careful examination revealed the subtle inconsistencies that marked them as forgeries, dates that didn't align with Henry's known activities, witnesses who couldn't be located, interest rates that no honest lender would charge. Marcus hired the best lawyer available in the territorial capital, a sharp-eyed man named Patterson, who specialized in land disputes and had little patience for fraudulent schemes. Together, they began building a case that would expose the development company's deception, but Patterson warned that the process could take months. "These land grab operations are sophisticated," Patterson explained during one of their meetings. "They target isolated properties where the owners have died or disappeared, counting on the fact that no one will fight back. The fact that you're here with resources and determination changes their calculations considerably." The children adapted to Marcus's presence with remarkable grace. Rebecca began setting a place for him at every meal without being asked, and Daniel started including him in the daily planning discussions about chores and maintenance. They didn't push for affection or dramatic declarations. They simply made space for him in their lives and waited to see if he would choose to fill it. Marcus found himself drawn into their routines almost without realizing it. He helped Daniel repair a section of fence damaged by wind, his city-soft hands remembering the calluses of his youth. He listened to Rebecca practice her letters, marveling at her determination to master reading despite having no formal schooling. He shared stories of his cattle operation, describing the vast herds and endless grasslands that made up his empire to the south. "Do you miss it?" Rebecca asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "Your big ranch and all those cattle?" Marcus considered the question seriously. A month ago, the answer would have been simple. His business was his life, his identity, his defense against the emptiness that had consumed him for 15 years. Now, sitting in this modest cabin with these remarkable children, he found the answer more complex. "I miss the work," he said finally. "There's satisfaction in building something, in seeing it grow and prosper, but I don't miss the loneliness." Daniel looked up from the wooden horse he was carving, a project that had emerged from some inner need to create rather than simply maintain. "Were you lonely, even with all those people working for you?" "Especially then," Marcus admitted. "You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone if you don't let anyone get close enough to matter." The wooden horse in Daniel's hands was taking shape with surprising skill. The boy had inherited some artistic talent along with his practical nature, and he worked the wood with patient precision. Marcus watched him carve, remembering another wooden horse he'd made years ago for a different child in what felt like another lifetime. "That's fine work," Marcus said. "Where did you learn to carve?" "Pa taught me some, said a man should be able to make things with his hands, not just break them." Daniel held up the horse. examining his progress. "This one's for Rebecca. Her birthday's next month." The gesture was so simple and so loving that Marcus felt his throat tighten. These children had lost their parents, their security, their childhood, innocence, yet they continued to think of each other's happiness. They'd learned lessons about love and sacrifice that Marcus was only beginning to understand. As November deepened into December and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks, Marcus felt himself settling into a life he'd never imagined. The urgent telegrams from his business partners went unanswered for days at a time. The cattle empire that had defined him for 15 years began to feel like someone else's dream, important but distant, here, in this small cabin with these extraordinary children. He was discovering what it meant to be needed not for his wealth or influence, but simply for his presence. Daniel and Rebecca didn't care about his business success or social standing. They cared about whether he would be there when they woke up, whether he would keep his promises, whether he would choose them over the easier path of walking away. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus Holloway felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Winter settled over Cedar Ridge like a heavy quilt, bringing with it a stillness that seemed to slow time itself. The legal battles with Crawford's development company had intensified, requiring Marcus to make frequent trips to the territorial capital for depositions and court filings. Each journey meant leaving Daniel and Rebecca for days at a time, and he found himself reluctant to go despite the necessity. The children had adapted to his periodic absences with their characteristic resilience, but Marcus could see the worry in their eyes each time he prepared to leave. They'd learned too young that adults could disappear without warning, that security was a fragile thing, easily shattered by circumstances beyond their control. "How long this time?" Daniel asked, as Marcus packed his traveling bag for another legal consultation. 3 days, maybe 4. Patterson wants to review the testimony from Crawford's supposed witnesses. Marcus folded his spare shirt with careful precision, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Mrs. Sullivan will check on you daily, and Doc Whitman is just down the street if you need anything." Rebecca looked up from her mending, the partially completed quilt spread across her lap. Martha Sullivan had been teaching her to finish the piece her mother had started before the fever took her, and the work had become a source of comfort during the long winter evenings. "We'll be fine," Rebecca said with quiet certainty. "We always..." The simple statement carried layers of meaning that made Marcus's chest tight. These children had learned to be fine on their own because circumstances had given them no choice. Now they were slowly learning to trust that someone would return, that their newly formed family had the strength to weather temporary separations. "I know you will be," Marcus replied, kneeling down to look Rebecca in the eye. "But I want you to know that coming back to you two is the most important thing in my life now. Not the court case, not my business. You." Daniel straightened with visible pride. "We'll keep everything running smooth. The animals are healthy, we've got plenty of firewood, and Rebecca's gotten so good at cooking that we might be too fat to fit through the door by the time you get back." Marcus's departure was delayed by an unexpected visitor, a telegram messenger, who'd ridden out from town despite the threatening weather. The message was brief, but carried the weight of 15 years' accumulated regret. "Father, received your letter. Would like to visit Cedar Ridge and meet my new family. Will arrive by train January 15th if agreeable. Your son, James." Marcus read the telegram 3 times before the words fully registered. James, his James, wanted to come west, wanted to meet Daniel and Rebecca, wanted to try rebuilding the relationship that Marcus had destroyed through his own cowardice and pride. "Good news?" Daniel asked, noticing Marcus's expression. "My son wants to visit. He's coming next month." Rebecca clapped, her hands together with delight. "How wonderful. We'll make sure everything is perfect for him, won't we, Daniel?" But Daniel's reaction was more complex, his young face showing a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty or even jealousy. "Will he want to stay?" I mean permanently? The question revealed a fear that Marcus should have anticipated. Daniel and Rebecca had just begun to feel secure in their place with him, and now they were facing the possibility that his real son might displace them in his affections. Marcus set down the telegram and pulled both children close. Listen, to me, both of you, James is my son and I love him, but you two have become my children too, and nothing is going to change that. We're a family now, all of us together, but he's your blood, Daniel said quietly. That's different. Sometimes it is, Marcus admitted. And sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born to. You and Rebecca chose me just like I chose you. That makes us just as much family as blood ever could. The conversation seemed to settle something in both children's minds, and Marcus left for his legal meetings with a lighter heart than he'd expected. The prospect of seeing James again was both thrilling and terrifying, but knowing that Daniel and Rebecca would be part of that reunion made it feel like a beginning rather than an ending. The court proceedings in the territorial capital proved more encouraging than Marcus had dared hope. Patterson had uncovered significant irregularities in Crawford's documentation, including witness signatures that appeared to be forgeries and dates that didn't align with known historical events. More importantly, they'd discovered that the Cedar Ridge Development Company was part of a larger network of land speculation firms that had been operating similar schemes across 3 territories. We're building a solid case, Patterson explained over dinner at the capital's best hotel, but Crawford isn't going to give up easily. Men like him have too much invested in these operations to walk away without a fight. Marcus nodded grimly. He'd suspected from the beginning that Crawford's operation was more extensive than a simple property grab, but the scope of the conspiracy was larger than he'd imagined. What's our next move? We press for a full investigation of the development. Company's business practices, if we can prove this is part of a systematic fraud. It strengthens our position considerably. Patterson consulted his notes. I've also been in contact with federal marshals who've been tracking similar operations. They're very interested in what we've uncovered. The return journey to Cedar Ridge took 2 days through snow that seemed determined to bury the entire territory. Marcus found himself pushing hard through weather that should have forced him to seek shelter, driven by an urgency he couldn't quite explain. The closer he got to home, and it was home now, in a way his mansion had never been, the stronger the pull became. He arrived to find the cabin glowing with warm lamplight and the smell of Rebecca's cooking filling the crisp air. Daniel was in the barn tending to the animals with his usual thorough attention, and Rebecca was putting finishing touches on an apple pie that made Marcus's mouth water just looking at it. "You're back early," Rebecca said, rising to greet him, with a hug that warmed him more than the blazing fire. "The weather was breaking, and I wanted to be home," Marcus replied, surprised by how natural the word home felt on his tongue. Daniel appeared from the barn, snow dusting his shoulders and a smile lighting his face. "How did the court business go?" "Better than expected. We're building a strong case, and we've got federal support now." Marcus settled into his chair at the kitchen table, feeling tension he hadn't realized he was carrying flow out of his shoulders. "But enough about that. Tell me what I missed while I was gone." The next hour passed in comfortable conversation as Rebecca served her excellent pie, and Daniel recounted the small adventures and observations of frontier life. A fox had been prowling around the chicken coop, but Daniel had scared it off without harming it. Rebecca had finished 2 more squares of her mother's quilt. Martha Sullivan had stopped by with news that 2 more families were planning to move away before spring, discouraged by the harsh winter and uncertain prospects. The town's getting smaller, Daniel observed with the matter-of-fact assessment that Marcus had learned to value. "If too many more folks leave, there won't be much of Cedar Ridge left. Towns have to earn their survival out here," Marcus replied. "The ones that offer something worth staying for endure. The others fade away." "What does Cedar Ridge offer?" Rebecca asked, her needle moving steadily through the quilt fabric. Marcus considered the question seriously. Good people, mostly. Land that can support a man willing to work it. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the chance to discover that the family you need has been waiting for you all along. As evening deepened and the wind picked up outside, Marcus felt a contentment he'd never experienced before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, court proceedings, business decisions, the complex logistics of preparing for James's visit. But tonight, sitting in this warm cabin with these extraordinary children, he felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money or land or social position. The partially completed quilt in Rebecca's lap caught his attention. Squares of fabric, in warm colors, stitched together with patient care to create something beautiful and functional. It struck him as a perfect metaphor for what they were building together, taking the scattered pieces of their broken lives and weaving them into something stronger than any of them could have created alone. The telegram that would change everything arrived on a crystalline January morning, when the air was so cold it burned the lungs and the snow crunched underfoot like broken glass. Marcus was splitting wood behind the cabin, working off the restless energy that had plagued him since learning of James's impending visit, when Daniel came running from town with the yellow envelope clutched in his mittened hand. "Telegraph for you, Mr. Holloway," Daniel panted, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "The operator said it was urgent." Marcus set down his axe and wiped his hands on his coat before taking the telegram. The return address made his heart skip. Boston, Massachusetts, James's city. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope and read the message that would crack open 15 years of carefully maintained emotional walls. "Father, have thought long about your letter and your new family. Forgive me for taking so long to write. Mother's death taught me that time with those we love is precious. I was angry for many years, but anger is a burden I no longer wish to carry. Yes, I want to meet Daniel and Rebecca. More than that, I want to know the man my father has become. Arriving Cedar Ridge, January 20th on afternoon stage. Your son, James William Holloway." Marcus read the telegram twice, then sank onto a nearby stump as the full weight of those words settled into his chest. Forgiveness. After 15 years of guilt and self-recrimination, his son was offering forgiveness. Not just acceptance or tolerance, but the kind of grace that could heal wounds that had festered for a decade and a half. "Mr. Holloway," Daniel's voice carried concern. "Is everything all right?" Marcus looked up to find both children watching, him with worried expressions. Rebecca had emerged from the cabin without her coat, and her arms were wrapped around herself against the cold. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "Everything is very all right. James, my son, he's coming to visit, and he says he forgives me." Rebecca ran to him and threw her thin arms around his neck, her warmth a balm against the cold air and the overwhelming emotions flooding through him. "Oh, Mr. Holloway, that's wonderful news!" Daniel's reaction was more measured, but no less genuine. "When will he arrive?" "January 20th. 5 days from now." Marcus stood slowly, still holding Rebecca, and extended his free arm to include Daniel in the embrace. "I want you both to know that I'm nervous about this. I haven't seen James since he was 5 years old. I don't know what kind of man he's become, or how he'll feel about sharing his father with 2 other children. We'll make sure he feels welcome," Rebecca said, with the determined hospitality that never failed to amaze Marcus. "Won't we, Daniel?" "Of course we will," Daniel replied, though Marcus could see the boy's own nervousness about meeting the son who had prior claim to Marcus's affections. His family. The next 5 days passed in a flurry of preparation that would have rivaled planning for a presidential visit. Rebecca threw herself into cooking and cleaning with religious fervor, determined that every corner of the cabin would shine when James arrived. Daniel split enough wood to last through 2 winters and made repairs to things that didn't need repairing, channeling his nervous energy into practical activity. Marcus found himself caught between anticipation and dread, his emotions swinging, like a pendulum between hope and fear. What if James had changed his mind? What if the young man who arrived bore no resemblance to the laughing child he remembered? What if James took one look at his father's new life and decided that some bridges were too badly burned to rebuild? Martha Sullivan proved invaluable during the preparations, sharing her wisdom about family reunions and offering practical advice about accommodating an unexpected guest in a cabin designed for 3. "The boy's coming because he wants to," Martha reminded Marcus during one of his more anxious moments. "That tells you everything you need to know about his character. Trust in that, and trust in what you've built here with Daniel and Rebecca." The afternoon of January 20th arrived clear and cold, with sunlight that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like scattered diamonds. Marcus had positioned himself on the front porch, where he could see the road from town, his pocket watch marking the minutes until the stage was due to arrive. Daniel sat beside him, whittling another wooden animal for Rebecca's growing collection, while Rebecca paced between the cabin and the porch, too nervous to sit still. "What if he doesn't like us?" Rebecca asked for the 10th time that day. "Then he'll be the one missing out," Marcus replied, pulling her close. "But I don't think that's going to happen. You two are pretty impossible not to like." The sound of harness leather and rolling wheels reached them before the stage came into view. Around the bend in the road, Marcus stood slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs as the conveyance approached the cabin. Through the dust and the small windows, he could see the outline of a passenger, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of well-tailored coat that spoke of Eastern prosperity. The stage rolled to a stop, and the driver called down cheerfully, "Got a passenger for the Holloway place." The door opened, and James William Holloway stepped down onto the frozen ground. He was taller than Marcus had expected, with the same dark hair and strong jaw that marked him unmistakably as family. But his eyes held a depth and wisdom that spoke of a man who'd wrestled with life's complexities and emerged stronger. For the struggle, for a moment, father and son simply looked at each other across the years and the accumulated weight of separation. Then James smiled, the same bright expression he'd worn as a child, and walked forward with his hand extended. "Hello, father," he said simply. Marcus took the offered hand, then pulled his son into an embrace that was 15 years overdue. "Hello, James. Welcome home." They held each other in the cold air while Daniel and Rebecca watched with wide eyes, witnesses to a healing that transcended words. When they finally separated, both men had tears in their eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "These must be Daniel and Rebecca," James said, turning to the children with the same warm smile. "I've heard wonderful things about you both." Rebecca stepped forward with the courage that never failed to astound Marcus. "We're very pleased to meet you, James. We've been looking forward to your visit." Daniel was more reserved, but he offered his hand with grave dignity. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge, sir." James knelt down to Daniel's level, a gesture that immediately earned him points in Marcus's estimation. "I understand you're the man of the house when father's away. That's a big responsibility." "I don't mind it," Daniel replied, straightening. With visible pride, "Rebecca and I take care of each other." "That's what family does," James agreed, then looked up at Marcus with eyes that held understanding beyond his years. "I'm looking forward to learning how to be part of this family." As they gathered James's bags and headed toward the cabin, Marcus felt a completeness he'd never imagined possible. The broken pieces of his life, the son he'd abandoned, the children he'd chosen, the man he'd finally learned to become, were coming together into something beautiful and whole. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing Rebecca's excellent pot roast and listening to James tell stories of his life in Boston, Marcus caught sight of the family Bible sitting on the nearby shelf. The same worn leather volume that had held his mother's faith and marked their family's history for generations. Tomorrow, he decided, he would add new entries to those carefully kept records. The day Daniel and Rebecca became his children, and the day James came home. The discovery came 3 days after James's arrival, hidden among Henry's personal papers that Marcus had been avoiding since his brother's death. James had been helping to organize the documents for the ongoing legal battle when his trained eye, sharpened by years of working in Boston's financial district, caught irregularities that everyone else had missed. "Father, you need to see this," James called from Henry's small desk, his voice carrying an urgency that made Marcus look up from where he was teaching Rebecca a card game. Marcus crossed to the desk where James had spread out a collection of papers, letters, receipts, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal that Marcus had never seen before. James pointed to the journal, his finger tracing lines of Henry's careful handwriting. "Your brother was conducting his own investigation into Crawford's operation. This journal documents everything: forged deeds, false witnesses, systematic theft of orphaned children's property across 3 territories." Marcus took the journal with hands that weren't quite steady. Henry's writing was meticulous as always, recording dates, names, and detailed observations that painted a picture of a conspiracy far larger than anyone had imagined. The Cedar Ridge Development Company was just one tentacle of an organization that had been stealing land from vulnerable families for nearly 5 years. "Look at this entry," James continued, flipping to a page marked with a pressed flower. Henry writes, "Confirmed today that at least 14 orphaned families have lost their inheritance to fraudulent claims. The pattern is always the same. Parents die, mysterious debts appear, children are shipped east, and the land disappears into Crawford's network. I fear Daniel and Rebecca may be next." Marcus felt cold settle into his bones as he read further. Henry had been tracking the conspiracy for months, documenting cases across Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana territories. Children as young as 6 had been separated from siblings and sent to different institutions to prevent them from corroborating each other's claims. Families that should have inherited modest but valuable properties found themselves destitute and scattered. "There's more," James said grimly, turning to another section. Henry identifies Crawford's partners, territorial officials, court clerks, even some judges who've been paid to look the other way. This isn't just land fraud, Father. It's systematic corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. Daniel and Rebecca had drawn closer during the conversation, sensing the gravity of what was being revealed. Rebecca clutched her wooden horse tightly, while Daniel's face showed the careful blankness he'd learned to wear when adults discussed matters that might threaten their security. "What does this mean for us?" Daniel asked quietly. Marcus closed the journal and looked at the 3 young people who'd become his world. "It means we're not just fighting for your property anymore. We're fighting to expose a conspiracy that's been destroying families across the frontier." James leaned back in his chair, his business training evident as he analyzed the situation. "The question is whether we can use this information effectively. If Crawford's network includes territorial officials, they'll move to suppress the evidence before we can present it in court." "Henry thought of that too," Marcus said, opening the journal to its final entries. "Listen to this. Have sent copies of all documentation to Federal Marshal Thomas Quinn in Denver. If anything happens to me, Quinn will know where to look for the truth. My greatest hope is that Marcus will come to care for Daniel and Rebecca, as I have, and that together they'll have the strength to fight what I could not fight alone." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Henry had known he was dying, had known the children would be vulnerable, and had arranged everything, including Marcus's involvement, as protection against the forces arrayed against them. His brother had trusted that beneath all the guilt and self-recrimination, the man Henry remembered from their childhood still existed. Rebecca moved to Marcus's side and took his hand with her characteristic gentleness. "Henry believed in you. He knew you'd take care of us. But why didn't he tell anyone about the investigation while he was alive?" James asked, studying the journal's chronology. Marcus found the answer in Henry's own words, written just weeks before his death, cannot risk exposure until the children are safe. If Crawford learns I've been documenting his activities, he'll move against Daniel and Rebecca immediately. My death will be attributed to consumption. But an investigation into the conspiracy could make them targets. Better to let Marcus discover the truth when he has the resources and determination to act. The full scope of Henry's sacrifice began to dawn on Marcus. His brother had died protecting these children, taking his knowledge to the grave to keep them safe, until someone with the power to fight back could take up the cause. "We need to contact this Marshal Quinn immediately," James said, but Marcus was already shaking his head. "Crawford has been watching us closely since I arrived. If we telegraph Denver, he'll know within hours. We need to be smarter than that." That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table planning their next moves, Martha Sullivan arrived with news that confirmed their worst fears. She knocked on the door with unusual urgency, and when Marcus let her in, her face was grave. "There's been developments," she said without preamble. "Crawford's brought in additional men, claim they're surveyors, but they look more like hired guns to me. And Judge Morrison's been asking questions about your legal challenges, Marcus. Odd questions, like he's looking for ways to expedite the foreclosure proceedings." James and Marcus exchanged meaningful glances. Judge Morrison was mentioned several times in Henry's journal as someone who'd ruled suspiciously in Crawford's favor on multiple occasions. "There's something else," Martha continued, lowering her voice even though they were alone in the cabin. "Doc Whitman heard talk in the saloon about moving the children to protective custody if the guardianship proceedings get too complicated. Seems someone's worried about their testimony." The threat was clear. Crawford's network was preparing to remove Daniel and Rebecca from the equation entirely, probably shipping them to institutions so far away that they'd never be found again. "We can't wait for the courts," Marcus said firmly. "If Crawford's people take the children, we'll never see them again." "What are you suggesting?" James asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "We leave tonight, take Daniel and Rebecca somewhere safe while we figure out how to expose this conspiracy without putting them at risk." Rebecca's eyes went wide. "Leave Cedar Ridge." "But this is our home. Sometimes you have to leave home to save it," Marcus replied gently. "We'll come back when it's safe, when Crawford's network has been exposed and destroyed." Daniel stood up with sudden determination. "No." The simple word carried such authority that everyone turned to look at him. At 10 years old, he seemed to grow taller as he spoke. "I won't run anymore. We've lost our parents, our security, everything we thought we could count on. But we're not going to lose this land too." Daniel's voice grew stronger with each word. "Henry believed you could fight for us, Mr. Holloway. Well, it's time to fight." "Daniel, you don't understand the danger," Marcus began. "I understand plenty," Daniel interrupted, showing the steel core that had kept him and Rebecca alive through months of hardship. "I understand that Crawford thinks he can steal from children because children don't fight back. But I'm not just a child anymore, and neither is Rebecca. We're your children, and that means we're fighters too." Rebecca nodded firmly. "Daniel's right. If we run, they win. If we stay and fight, maybe we lose, but at least we lose trying to do what's right." Marcus looked at these two extraordinary children who'd already shown more courage than most adults ever would, then at his son James, who'd traveled across the country to help heal a broken family. Around him were the legal documents that could destroy Crawford's conspiracy, the journal that contained Henry's final gift, and the family Bible that had witnessed generations of Holloway struggles and triumphs. "All right," he said finally. "We fight, but we fight smart and we fight together." James smiled with grim satisfaction. "Good, because I've been thinking about how to contact Marshal Quinn without alerting Crawford's network. And I think I have an idea that might just work." As they huddled around the table making plans that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of dozens of families across the territory, Marcus felt a pride that had nothing to do with wealth or business. Success. These were his children, by birth and by choice, and they were about to wage a battle that would test everything they'd learned about courage, family, and the price of doing what's right. The forged legal documents that Crawford's organization had used to steal from so many families would finally be exposed for what they were: weapons turned against the innocent by those who valued profit above human dignity. But Marcus and his family had weapons of their own: truth, determination, and the unbreakable bonds that form when people choose to stand together against the darkness. James's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than risk telegraphing Marshal Quinn directly, he would return to Cheyenne under the pretense of handling business affairs for Marcus's cattle operation, then travel to Denver to deliver Henry's journal personally. Meanwhile, Marcus would remain in Cedar Ridge with Daniel and Rebecca, maintaining the appearance of normal daily life, while secretly preparing for what might become a siege. "The key is timing," James explained as they worked through the details. "By lamplight, Crawford's network expects us to play by legal rules, file motions, wait for court dates, follow proper procedures. They're not prepared for someone to go around the territorial system directly to federal authorities. Martha Sullivan had agreed to help coordinate communications using her general store as a message hub. Doc Whitman would monitor any unusual activity among Crawford's men while keeping a medical bag ready in case violence erupted. Even the aging pastor of the nearly empty church had volunteered to help, offering the sanctuary as a safe haven if needed. "I don't like leaving you here while I'm gone," James said as he prepared to depart the next morning. The stage to Cheyenne would arrive within the hour, and every moment of delay increased the risk that Crawford would suspect their true intentions. "We'll be fine," Marcus replied, though he felt anything but confident. "Daniel and Rebecca have been managing on their own for months. A few more days won't make a difference." But as Marcus watched the stage disappear down the snow-covered road, carrying his son away, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. For 15 years, he'd used wealth and influence to solve his problems. Now, he faced enemies who had their own wealth and influence, plus the advantage of operating in shadows where normal rules didn't apply. Rebecca seemed to sense his unease. "James will be all right," she said, slipping her small hand into his. "He's smart and brave, just like his father." "His father made a lot of mistakes," Marcus replied. "But he learned from them," Daniel added, appearing from the barn where he'd been doing morning chores. "That's what makes someone wise instead of just smart." The boy's insight never failed to surprise Marcus. At 10 years old, Daniel possessed an understanding of human nature that most adults never achieved. Rebecca had the same depth, expressing it through intuition and empathy rather than Daniel's analytical approach. That afternoon brought their first test. Crawford himself arrived at the cabin, accompanied by 2 men who wore their guns with the casual familiarity of those accustomed to violence. Marcus met them on the front porch, positioning himself so that his own weapon would be easily accessible while keeping Daniel and Rebecca safely inside. "Holloway," Crawford said with false friendliness, "I heard your son was visiting. Shame. He had to leave so soon." The comment confirmed that Crawford's network was watching their every move. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Business called him back east. You know how it is." "Indeed I do. Speaking of business, I wanted to discuss our previous conversation about reaching an accommodation over the debt situation." Crawford's smile was as cold as the winter air. "My associates here were just commenting on how dangerous frontier life can be, especially for families with children." The threat was delivered with elegant subtlety, but it was unmistakable. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, but years of business negotiations had taught him to control his emotions. "I appreciate your concern for our safety," Marcus replied, evenly, "but we're quite comfortable here. Are you? Because I understand there have been incidents lately, break-ins, threats against lone travelers, that sort of thing. Terrible to think that children might be caught up in such violence." Crawford's companions shifted slightly, hands moving closer to their weapons. The message was clear. Accept the buyout offer or face consequences that would make their previous troubles seem trivial. I'll certainly take your warning under advisement, Marcus said. Was there anything else? Crawford studied Marcus for a long moment, clearly trying to gauge whether his threats had achieved their intended effect. Finally, he tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Just wanted to be neighborly. Good day, Holloway. As the three men rode away, Marcus felt Daniel and Rebecca appear at his side. Both children had been listening from just inside the door, and their faces showed that they'd understood the subtext of the conversation perfectly. They're going to try to hurt us, Rebecca said matter-of-factly. They're going to try, Marcus agreed, but we're not going to make it easy for them. That evening, Marcus began implementing defensive preparations that drew on half-forgotten lessons from his younger days on the frontier. He checked and cleaned his weapons, inventoried their ammunition, and identified potential escape routes. In from the cabin, Daniel helped with grim efficiency, asking practical questions about sightlines and defensive positions. Are you scared? Rebecca asked as they secured the cabin for the night. Marcus considered lying, then decided these children had earned the right to honest answers. Yes, I'm scared, but not of Crawford or his men. I'm scared of failing you two the way I failed James and his mother. You didn't fail them, Daniel said firmly. You made mistakes, but you came back to fix them. That's what matters. The next 2 days passed in tense quiet. Marcus maintained their normal routines while staying alert for any signs that Crawford's threats were escalating to action. Martha Sullivan stopped by daily with supplies and news, reporting that Crawford's men were making inquiries around town about Marcus's background and business interests. They're probing for weaknesses, she warned, looking for ways to pressure you beyond the direct approach. On the 3rd day, the pressure began in earnest. A delegation from the Territorial Land Office arrived with documents claiming to investigate irregularities in Henry's property transfer to the children. The officials were polite but insistent, demanding access to all records and threatening to freeze the property pending their review. Marcus recognized the tactic immediately: bureaucratic harassment designed to create legal complications that would tie up the property for months or years. While fighting the land office proceedings, they would be vulnerable to Crawford's other pressures. This is temporary harassment, Marcus explained to Daniel and Rebecca after the officials left. They're trying to wear us down, make us feel like the walls are closing in. Are they? Daniel asked. Only if we let them. James should reach Denver today or tomorrow. Once Marshal Quinn gets involved, everything changes. But that night brought news that changed everything in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. Doc Whitman arrived after dark, slipping through the back door with the stealth of a man who'd learned. I cautioned the hard way. There's been developments, Doc said without preamble. Got word that Crawford's bringing in a territorial judge from Laramie, Judge Harrison. Man's got a reputation for expedited proceedings and creative interpretations of property law. Marcus felt his heart sink. If Crawford could arrange for a friendly judge to hear their case, all of Henry's documentation and Marcus's legal maneuvering would be worthless. How long do we have? Marcus asked. Harrison's due tomorrow afternoon. Word is they want to hold an emergency hearing about the children's guardianship and the property claims. Doc Whitman's weathered face was grim. If they rule against you, they could take Daniel and Rebecca into custody immediately. The trap was closing faster than Marcus had anticipated. Crawford wasn't content to wait for the federal investigation. He was moving to eliminate the witnesses before they could testify. We can't wait for James to return, Marcus said, his mind racing through increasingly desperate options. If they take the children tomorrow, we'll never see them again. Daniel stepped forward with the quiet courage that never ceased to amaze Marcus. Then we don't let them take us. Daniel, no, listen, the boy insisted. You taught us that. Sometimes you have to fight even when the odds are bad. Well, the odds are bad now, but we're still a family. Families stick together. Rebecca nodded firmly. Whatever happens, we face it together. As Marcus looked at these two extraordinary children who'd already survived more hardship than most adults ever would, he felt something settle in his chest, like steel cooling into strength. They were right. Running would only delay the inevitable. Their best chance lay in standing firm and fighting with everything they had. "All right," he said finally. "We fight. But we fight smart, and we make sure that win or lose, the truth gets told." Doc Whitman cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. Martha's been talking to some of the other townspeople, folks who've watched what Crawford's operation has been doing to families across the territory. They're not all willing to stand by and watch children get railroaded by corrupt officials. What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're not as alone as Crawford thinks you are. This community may be small, but it knows right from wrong. And it's getting mighty tired of watching bullies pick on people who can't fight back." As they spent the night making final preparations for what might be their last stand, Marcus felt a pride that transcended fear. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it as a family. Not the family he'd been born to or the one he'd abandoned, but the one he'd chosen, and that had chosen him in return. The worn leather Bible sat on the kitchen table, its pages holding the record of generations who'd faced their own trials with faith and determination. Tomorrow, Marcus thought, they would discover whether the Holloway family still possessed the strength to stand against the darkness that threatened everything. They'd built together. Judge Harrison arrived in Cedar Ridge like a storm front, his black carriage rolling into town with an escort of territorial marshals that made the proceedings feel more like a military occupation than a legal hearing. Marcus watched from the cabin's front window as the entourage established itself at the hotel, noting the efficient way Crawford's men coordinated with the official party. "They're not even trying to hide the corruption anymore," Marcus muttered, adjusting the tin star badge that Doc Whitman had pinned to his coat an hour earlier. The badge was a temporary appointment, Deputy Marshal of Cedar Ridge, that gave Marcus limited legal authority to protect the community and arrest those who threatened its peace. It was a thin reed to lean on against the forces arrayed against them, but it was something. "When do we have to be at the hearing?" Rebecca asked, smoothing down her best dress with nervous hands. 10 o'clock, Marcus replied, checking his pocket. "Watch." They had 30 minutes to prepare for what might be the most important legal proceeding of their lives. "Remember what we discussed. Tell the truth, stay calm, and don't let them intimidate you." Daniel appeared from the back room wearing his Sunday clothes, and an expression of grim determination that made him look older than his 10 years. "I've been thinking about what Henry wrote in his journal, about how Crawford's organization targets orphaned children because they don't have anyone to fight for them." "What about it?" "Well, we're not alone anymore. We have you and you have us. That changes their calculations." Marcus felt a surge of pride at the boy's strategic thinking. Daniel was right. Crawford's network operated by isolating their victims, making them feel powerless and abandoned. But the Holloway family was neither powerless nor abandoned, and it was time to make that clear. The walk to the makeshift courthouse, the town's largest building, normally used for community gatherings, took them past clusters of townspeople who nodded with quiet support. Martha Sullivan fell into step beside them, carrying a folder of documents that she'd volunteered to present as evidence. "Half the town's turned out for this," she observed. "Folks are mighty curious to see what Judge Harrison makes of Henry's investigation." Doc Whitman joined them at the courthouse steps, along with Pastor Reynolds and several other residents who'd decided to witness the proceedings. Marcus realized that Crawford had miscalculated. By bringing in outside officials and treating the hearing like a fait accompli, he'd aroused the community's suspicions and protective instincts. Inside the building, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Crawford sat at one table with his lawyer and several well-dressed men Marcus didn't recognize. Judge Harrison presided from behind a makeshift bench, his severe features and cold eyes suggesting that his reputation for expedited proceedings was well-deserved. "This hearing will address 2 related matters," Harrison announced as the room fell silent, First, the guardianship status of Daniel and Rebecca Cartwright. Second, the disputed ownership of the property in question. Mr. Crawford, you may present your case. Crawford's lawyer stood with theatrical flourish, presenting documents that painted Marcus as an unfit guardian who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge with suspicious motives. The children, he argued, would be better served by the territorial system that had already arranged proper care in established institutions. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, the property dispute has created an unstable environment wholly inappropriate for minors. The Cedar Ridge Development Company seeks only to resolve the legitimate debt claims that preceded Mr. Holloway's arrival. Marcus listened to the carefully constructed lies with growing anger, but forced himself to remain calm. Crawford's case was professionally presented and superficially convincing, exactly what he'd expected from a conspiracy that had operated successfully for years. When his turn came to speak, Marcus rose slowly and looked directly at Judge Harrison. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that these proceedings are based on fraudulent documentation and corrupted testimony. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Holloway. It's supported by serious evidence. Marcus gestured to Martha Sullivan, who approached the bench with Henry's journal and supporting documents. This journal, maintained by my late brother Henry Holloway, documents a systematic conspiracy to defraud orphaned families of their inheritances across 3 territories. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Martha handed the journal to Harrison. Crawford's face went pale as he realized what was being presented, and his lawyer began a series of objections that Harrison ignored while examining the evidence. These are remarkable allegations, Harrison said finally. Mr. Crawford, do you have a response to these claims? Before Crawford could answer, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the windows, Marcus could see riders approaching. At speed, a large group moving with military precision. His heart leaped as he recognized the lead rider, James, accompanied by men wearing federal badges. The courthouse door burst open as Federal Marshal Thomas Quinn strode in with James close behind. Quinn was a tall, weathered man with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and his presence immediately shifted the balance of power in the room. Judge Harrison, Quinn announced, I'm here to inform this court that the Cedar Ridge Development Company is under federal investigation for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering across multiple territories. Any proceedings involving their claims should be suspended pending the completion of our investigation. Crawford jumped to his feet. This is highly irregular. What's irregular, Quinn interrupted, is a territorial judge holding emergency hearings on matters currently under federal jurisdiction. He turned to Harrison with steely authority. Unless you'd like to explain to my superiors why you're interfering with a federal investigation, I suggest you postpone these proceedings indefinitely. Marcus felt Daniel and Rebecca move closer to his sides as the adults argued over jurisdictional authority and legal procedures. The children had endured months of uncertainty, and now their fate was being decided by forces far beyond their control. But Marcus had learned something important during his time with them. Sometimes the most powerful force in any conflict wasn't legal authority or political influence. It was the simple determination of people who refused to be broken by those who would prey on the innocent. The confrontation that followed would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for generations. Judge Harrison, faced with federal authority and mounting evidence of the conspiracy he'd been drawn into, made a calculated decision to distance himself from Crawford's organization. His expedited hearing dissolved into chaos as territorial officials scrambled to avoid being caught in the web of corruption that Marshal Quinn was systematically unraveling. Crawford, however, wasn't ready to surrender. As Quinn's deputies began serving arrest warrants on his associates, Crawford made a desperate play that revealed the true depth of his desperation. He signaled to his hired gunmen, who moved toward Daniel and Rebecca with the clear intention of taking them hostage. "Nobody moves," Crawford shouted, his veneer of civilized businessman finally stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. "These children are coming with me. Any interference will result in consequences you won't like." But Crawford had miscalculated the resolve of people who'd been pushed too far. Martha Sullivan stepped deliberately in front of the children, her weathered hands steady despite the guns pointed in her direction. Doc Whitman moved to flank her, followed by Pastor Reynolds and several other townspeople who formed a protective circle around the family they'd chosen to defend. "You'll have to go through all of us," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down more dangerous threats than a desperate land grabber. Marcus felt the weight of the deputy marshal's badge on his chest as he stepped forward, his hand resting on his weapon. "Crawford, you're under federal arrest for conspiracy and fraud. Your men can drop their weapons and walk away, or they can face the consequences of threatening children in front of a federal." "Marshal." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with armed men on both sides measuring odds and calculating risks. Then Daniel did something that surprised everyone in the room. He stepped out from behind the protective circle and walked directly toward Crawford, his young face calm and determined. "Mr. Crawford," Daniel said in his clear, steady voice, "you can steal our land. You can corrupt judges. You can threaten our family. But you can't make us afraid anymore. We know who we are, and we know what's right." Rebecca joined her brother, taking his hand and facing Crawford with the same quiet courage. "We're not just orphans you can push around. We're Holloways now, and Holloways don't run from bullies." The simple dignity of these two children, standing unafraid before armed men who terrorized families across 3 territories, seemed to break something in the tension that filled the room. Crawford's gunmen shifted uncomfortably. Suddenly, aware that they were threatening children in front of an entire community that was ready to fight back, Marshal Quinn used the moment to act. With swift precision, he and his deputies moved to arrest Crawford and disarm his men. The federal lawmen had the training and authority to end the confrontation without bloodshed, but it was the moral authority of 2 brave children that made it possible. "Benjamin Crawford," Quinn announced as he secured the handcuffs, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, corruption of territorial officials, and conspiracy to violate federal statutes regarding the protection of minors. Your organization is finished." As Crawford was led away in chains, his empire of theft and intimidation crumbling around him, Judge Harrison made his own retreat from the courthouse. The corrupt judge knew that his association with Crawford's network would end his career, but he was more concerned with avoiding federal charges than maintaining his dignity. In the aftermath of the arrests, Marcus found himself holding the family, Bible that had witnessed so many Holloway trials and triumphs. James approached with Marshal Quinn, both men wearing expressions of grim satisfaction at seeing justice finally served. "The federal investigation will take months to complete," Quinn explained, "but your guardianship of Daniel and Rebecca is secure, and their property rights are protected. Crawford's forged documents have been exposed, and the real ownership records confirm that Henry's bequest was legal and binding." James clapped his father on the shoulder. "It's over, father. You've won." But Marcus was looking at Daniel and Rebecca, who stood together with the quiet pride of those who'd faced their fears and emerged stronger. "We've won," he corrected. "All of us, together." The formal adoption proceedings took place 3 weeks later in the territorial capital, with Judge Morrison's replacement, a federal appointee with an impeccable reputation, presiding over the ceremony that made Daniel and Rebecca legally and officially part of the Holloway family. As Marcus signed the final documents that transformed their chosen family into a legal reality, he used the same family Bible that had recorded Holloway births, deaths, and marriages for generations. The worn leather volume now held new entries that marked not just legal changes, but the completion of a journey from broken lives to healing wholeness. "Do you have anything you'd like to say to your new children?" the judge asked with a smile. That suggested he understood the deeper significance of what was taking place. Marcus looked at Daniel and Rebecca, then at James, who'd chosen to extend his visit indefinitely to help build the ranch that would be their family's new legacy. "Just that I'm honored to be their father, and I promise to do better than I've done before." Daniel stepped forward, with the dignity that never failed to amaze Marcus. "And we promise to be the kind of children who make their father proud." As they left the courthouse together, officially and permanently a family, Marcus felt the weight of 15 years, guilt finally lifting from his shoulders. The mistakes of his past would always be part of his story, but they no longer defined his future. Spring arrived in Cedar Ridge like a promise kept, bringing with it the sweet scent of wildflowers and the sound of snow melting into streams that would feed the valley through another growing season. Marcus stood on the expanded porch of what had once been Henry's modest cabin, watching Daniel and Rebecca work in the garden they'd planned together through the long winter months. The past year had transformed more than just the seasons. The cabin had grown into a proper family home, with additional rooms that accommodated James's permanent residence and space for the extended family that had formed around their core. Martha Sullivan had become their chosen grandmother, joining them for Sunday dinners and offering the kind of wisdom that only comes from decades of frontier living. Doc Whitman served as unofficial grandfather, teaching the children about medicine and the importance of caring for their community. "Hard to believe it's been a year since that telegram arrived," James said, settling into the chair beside his father, with 2 cups of coffee that Rebecca had prepared with increasing skill. Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring both the warmth and the comfortable silence that had developed between them. James had transformed from the angry young man who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge into a true partner in building the ranch that would support their expanding family for generations to come. "Crawford's trial starts next month," Marcus observed, watching Daniel demonstrate proper planting technique to Rebecca. "Quinn says they've documented fraud cases across 5 territories now. Will you testify?" "We all will." Daniel and Rebecca want to face him in court, make sure he understands that his victims had names and families and dreams he tried to destroy. Marcus sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "I think it will be good for them to see justice served properly." The Cedar Ridge Ranch, as they decided to call their operation, had grown from Henry's 40 acres into a substantial spread that combined cattle grazing with agriculture and supported 3 families comfortably. James had proven to have an excellent head for business, while Daniel showed a natural talent for animal husbandry that promised to make him an exceptional rancher in his own right. Rebecca had discovered gifts that surprised everyone, particularly her ability to organize and manage the complex logistics of running a large household and ranch operation. At 9 years old, she could balance account books, plan meals for 12 people, and coordinate supply purchases with the efficiency of someone twice her age. "Mr. Holloway," Rebecca called from the garden, "should we plant the corn in the back section this year or save it for winter wheat? What do you think would be best?" Marcus called back, having learned that the children's opinions were often more practical than adult assumptions. Rebecca consulted the notebook where she kept track of crop rotations and soil conditions. "Daniel thinks the corn, but I think wheat. Makes more sense for feeding the cattle through next winter." "Then we'll go with wheat," Marcus decided. "Rebecca's usually right about these things." Daniel straightened from his planting with a grin that showed he harbored no resentment at being overruled by his younger sister. The children had learned to complement each other's strengths, creating a partnership that served them well in managing their responsibilities. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road, where a familiar carriage was raising. Dust in the afternoon sun. Pastor Reynolds was returning from his monthly circuit to the neighboring settlements, and his arrival usually meant news from the wider world beyond their valley. "Marcus!" the pastor called as he climbed down from his carriage. "Got a letter for you from the territorial governor's office. Looks official." Marcus accepted the envelope with curiosity rather than concern. The days when official mail brought threats were long past, replaced by correspondence about land grants, cattle certifications, and the routine business of legitimate ranching operations. The letter contained an invitation that made him smile. Governor Campbell was requesting Marcus to serve on a territorial commission investigating land fraud and developing new protections for orphaned families. The governor had written personally, "Your family's courage in exposing the Crawford conspiracy has inspired legislation that will protect vulnerable children for generations to come." "Good news?" James asked, noting his father's expression. "I do. Opportunity to make sure what happened to Daniel and Rebecca never happens to other children." Marcus folded the letter carefully. "They want me to help write new laws, protecting orphaned property rights." That evening, as they gathered around the dinner table that had become the heart of their home, Marcus shared the governor's invitation with the family. The discussion that followed revealed how far they'd all come in learning to make decisions together, weighing individual desires against family needs. "It would mean traveling to the capital regularly," Marcus explained, "being away from the ranch for weeks at a time, but it would help other children like us," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "Children who don't have anyone to fight for them." Daniel nodded agreement. Henry would have wanted that. He cared about all the families Crawford was hurting, not just us. As the conversation continued, Marcus found himself studying the faces. Around the table, James, serious and thoughtful as he considered the business implications. Daniel, weighing practical concerns against moral obligations. Rebecca, whose quiet wisdom often cut straight to the heart of complex issues. "I think you should do it," Rebecca said finally, "but only if you promise to come home to us." The simple condition, delivered with the matter-of-fact trust that characterized everything about Rebecca, made Marcus's throat tighten with emotion. These children had learned to trust again after losing everything, and that trust was more precious than any political appointment or business opportunity. "I promise," Marcus said solemnly. "This family comes first, always." Later that evening, after James had gone to check on the cattle and the children had settled into their bedrooms, Marcus found himself alone on the porch with the family Bible open on his lap. The leather was more worn now, softened by daily use and marked with new entries that recorded not just births and deaths, but the moments when broken lives had been mended into something stronger. He'd added Daniel and Rebecca's adoption on February 15th, 1883, in the same careful script his mother had used to record family milestones. Below that, he'd noted James's decision to make Cedar Ridge his permanent home, and Martha's honorary adoption as family grandmother. The Bible was becoming a record not just of blood relations, but of the chosen family that had formed around shared values and mutual love. The sound of footsteps on the porch boards announced Daniel's approach. The boy often sought out these quiet evening conversations, times when the day's work was done and serious thoughts could be shared without interruption. "Couldn't sleep?" Marcus asked, making room on the wooden bench. "Been thinking about the governor's letter," Daniel replied, settling beside him. "About how you deciding to stay with us changed everything." "It changed everything for me too," Marcus said. "I spent 15 years thinking I was too broken to be worth fixing. You and Rebecca taught me that people can heal if they're willing to let others help." Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley that spread below them in the moonlight. The land was peaceful now, settled and productive, supporting not just their family, but several others who'd moved to the area as word spread about the good soil and honest opportunities available in Cedar Ridge. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked. "Giving up your big cattle empire to take care of us?" Marcus considered the question seriously, as he'd learned to do with all of Daniel's inquiries. The boy deserved honest answers, not comfortable platitudes. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices," Marcus admitted. "But regret? No, this life, this family, it's given me something I never had before. What's that? Peace, Marcus said simply. I spent years accumulating wealth and power, but I was never at peace. Here, with you and Rebecca and James, I finally understand what it means to have enough. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, wearing her nightgown and carrying the wooden horse Daniel had carved for her birthday. The toy had become her talisman, a symbol of the love that could exist between siblings who chose to care for each other. Is this a family meeting without me? She asked with mock indignation. Just talking about how lucky we are, Marcus said, opening his arms to include her in their circle. Rebecca settled between them, leaning against Marcus's side with the comfortable affection that still amazed him after all these months. We are lucky, she agreed, but I think we made our own luck by choosing to be brave. As they sat together in the peaceful evening air, Marcus felt the completeness that had eluded him for so many years. The mistakes of his past would always be part of his story, but they no longer defined his present or limited his future. He'd learned that redemption wasn't a destination, but a daily choice. The choice to be better than he'd been before, to put others' needs above his own comfort, to build something lasting instead of just accumulating possessions. The new family. A portrait they'd had taken in town sat on the mantelpiece inside, 4 faces looking directly at the camera with expressions of quiet contentment. Marcus in his best suit, James beside him with the confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world, Daniel standing straight and proud in clothes that fit him properly for the first time in his life, and Rebecca smiling with the joy of a child who knew she was loved unconditionally. But the real portrait was here, on this porch, in the comfortable silence shared by people who'd chosen to become family, despite having no obligation to each other. They'd taken the scattered pieces of their broken lives and woven them together into something beautiful and strong. A tapestry of love, courage, and second chances that would endure long after they were gone. The promise Daniel had made that, first day, I will cut wood and my sister will cook, had been fulfilled in ways none of them could have imagined. They'd all learned to contribute their unique gifts to the family they'd built together, creating a home where love was expressed through daily acts of service and sacrifice. As the stars emerged overhead and the night sounds of the valley settled, around them, Marcus closed the family Bible and held his children close. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight they were together, safe and whole. For a man who'd spent 15 years running from the very idea of family, it was more than enough. It was everything.